if the courts decide that they're going to let the bill go forward under the federal Constitution, that's still not the end of the story. The way that our federal system works, the U.S. Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, provides a kind of bedrock level of constitutional freedom. And states are not allowed to drop below that level of protection for liberty. They are allowed to augment and provide additional liberty. So, for example, when the U.S. Supreme Court says that under the Fifth Amendment, cities are permitted to take away your home or your business and give it to someone else for their own private profit, a state can come back, modify its constitution, and say, you know what, you can't do that here. Private property rights are more protected here than they are under the U.S. Constitution. And that leads us to the Healthcare Freedom Amendment, which is under discussion here. And there are similar bills like this all over the country that are being considered. And the theory is that if the U.S. Constitution will not secure healthcare freedom to the citizens, then it's the obligation of the states to do so for their own citizens. There is a chance that this will work. It boils down to the way that the Supreme Court will interpret what's called the Supremacy Clause. I've actually got the text of the Supremacy Clause right here. And I'll tell you up front, it's a toss-up. I mean, there are questions about whether this will be a successful strategy on the part of those of us who believe in the importance of healthcare freedom. The Supremacy Clause reads, and this is from the U.S. Constitution, Article 6, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the constitutional laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." So, a plain reading of this provision says basically, as long as the Congress is making a law that fits within the U.S. Constitution, it doesn't matter if you have state laws or state constitutional provisions to the contrary. Now, I am not aware of courts being presented this question directly, where there is just a straight-up conflict between what the federal constitution, or what Congress wants to do, and what a state constitution requires. It is clear that the United States Constitution trumps the state constitution. So, for example, Colorado, several years back, tried to pass a constitutional amendment regarding rights for homosexuals. And the Supreme Court looked at that and said the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment invalidates this state constitutional amendment. So you can't have a state constitutional amendment that would run afoul of the U.S. Constitution. The question is, can a state constitutional amendment trump just a statute that Congress passes? Now, to evaluate this question, we have to look to history. How many people remember something called the Alien and Sedition Acts? It goes way back to U.S. history. I see a couple people remember this. I'll fill in the rest of you. In 1798, shortly after independence, shortly after the ratification of the Constitution, Congress passed a law that allowed the punishment of people who criticized certain government officials. And there immediately broke forth a firestorm of opposition. People recognized that this was entirely against the principles of freedom, and particularly the violation of the First Amendment. In response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, two of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, wrote what are called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. And the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions said, we do not recognize the legitimate authority of Congress to make this law. we believe this law violates the United States Constitution and therefore is void. Okay? This, keep in mind, was written in part by the father of the Constitution. And this is with the Supremacy Clause in place. So James Madison said there are circumstances under which a state can say, you will not apply this law in our boundaries. I highly recommend doing a little bit of research on the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, particularly for anyone who's interested in the concept of state sovereignty. That's the place to start. If you'll remember, the argument was ongoing from that point. In the early 1800s, you had states, particularly New England states, threatening to invalidate various laws passed by Congress. In 1830, you had the most serious crisis prior to the Civil War, where South Carolina objected to a tariff that Congress had passed that would be devastating to South Carolina's economy, and they said, we're going to nullify it. You simply will not enforce that here. Andrew Jackson, who was president at the time, sent the U.S. Army to South Carolina's borders and said, oh yes, you will enforce it there. And South Carolina backed off. But that was the most serious national crisis that we faced prior to the Civil War, over the question of, can states claim the authority to invalidate federal statutes? After the Civil War, there wasn't a whole lot of questioning. Once we had fought a war over the question of states' ability to run contrary to the federal government, the philosophy underlying that question seemed to fall out of vogue until relatively recently, and we've started to bring up again the question of the balance that ought to exist in our constitutional system between the federal government in Washington and our state governments. I think that this is the question that will have to be answered by the Supreme Court if, in fact, they're not willing to strike down the provisions of the health insurance mandate under the federal Constitution generally. One of my colleagues, Clint Bolick, who is a co-founder of the Institute for Justice, where I worked in Washington, and currently the leader of a constitutional litigation center out in Arizona, affiliated with the Goldwater Institute, he's been looking at recent cases decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, trying to decide where he thinks the court will go when posed this question. And he identified a handful of cases where the court showed a lot of discomfort with allowing a federal law to overcome protections that are built into the state constitution. And in fact, one of these cases has to do with Missouri. There was a case back in the 70s that dealt with Title I funds for education. And as many of you may or may not know, Missouri has a couple of constitutional provisions that do not permit the use of public funds at religious schools. Well, Title I directs public funds in some cases to religious schools because it's more interested in helping the students. It's less concerned with where they're going to school. So the question in that case was whether Title I could be operative in the state of Missouri. What they ended up doing is they said where most states would just take the Title I funds into the public treasury and then disperse them back out to these schools, in Missouri, we'll set up a separate fund so that that money never becomes property of the state of Missouri and it goes to the schools indirectly. And that's how they resolved it. So they avoided the constitutional conflict that way. And some of these other cases that Mr. Bolick has noted indicate an interest in other courts of making the same kind of accommodation where if it looks like there's going to be a conflict, they will steer away from that conflict